Hi, and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. I'm Dr. Williams, and this is our second lecture for Chapter 3, Single Subject Designs, talking about research designs and that are used in applied behavior analysis for individual treatment. So I mentioned in my last lecture, this is a duplicate slide, that we're going to talk about different types of research designs. Today I'm going to talk about the ABA, variations on the ABA reversal design. And then next time we'll talk about multiple baselines, alternating treatments, and changing criterion designs. So let's talk very quickly about baseline data. Again, this is just sort of a little bit of a review. Ideally, all single subject designs begin with baseline. Gathering baseline data is the first logical step. We want to observe the behavior in its natural context. We want to make sure that we've correctly defined the target behavior. We want to develop our data collection instruments. So once we understand the behavior, we want to start developing our operational definitions and deciding how we're going to gather our data. We want to start looking at and establishing our initial inter-observer agreement measures from our observers to make sure that they're trained and are ready to gather data. And once everything is in place, the next step is then finally to gather baseline data before any intervention is started. Baseline data, those initial observations that we do while we're defining the behaviors and while we're looking at those behaviors, logically lead to the collection of baseline data. That's the obvious next step. What is the target behavior like before we start treatment? We need that data so that we have our comparison data, so that when we start treatment, we'll have something to compare the changes in behavior back to what it was before. So remember, think about baseline data as sort of control group data in a group design. It provides a comparison in a single subject design. That's where the comparison data comes from. And it also allows you to compare different dimensions. So you might have you might have 5 or 6 baselines. You might have a baseline for the frequency of tantrums, for the intensity of tantrums, and another for the duration of tantrums. So each dimension of behavior deserves to have its own baseline measure. So the simplest design is the AB design. It only has 2 phases, baseline and treatment. It's very common in practice out in the real world because it may lead to effective behavior change. So you gather baseline data, you put in your intervention, and behavior improves. Ta-da! The person's not injuring themselves anymore. The aggression has gone down on the playground. The unfair arguing is declined for more effective forms of communication. There's all kinds of ways that we can use this. But there's one big problem when we only do A and B. And that is that we aren't absolutely clear about the evidence. The evidence is questionable because something else could have caused the behavior change. An example might be that you have a child who is behaving, raising problems, having issues, maybe being defiant in the classroom, and you devise an intervention program and you put it into place, but you put it into place at the exact time that the courts decide that the child is going to no longer live with one parent and be housed with another. And so it may appear to you that your treatment has been effective, but it could be that the parenting style at home is different, and that's what's leading to the observed behavior change. So the functional relationship between the treatment and the change that we see, it remains unclear. We can't be sure that it was the treatment that worked. In fact, the AB design, the simple AB only design, is not a true research design because it's flawed. It doesn't rule out alternative causes for the behavior change. It doesn't rule out confounding variables. You can't say for sure, you can't say scientifically that it's the treatment that led to the behavior change. It doesn't rule out other possible causes. And so AB designs are flawed and don't provide you with the correct information that you're really looking for, which is, does the treatment actually work for that client? So in behavior analysis, we don't use A/B designs. They're typically used in the field by non-professional individuals. They're used by teachers, they're used by doctors, they're used by occupational therapists, they're used by parents. They set new rules and the behavior changes, and they assume that it's the rules that made the change. Or they set a new program and they assume that the improvements in the person's behavior or condition is due to the new treatment plan that you've put into place. But it could very well be a rival hypothesis. It could be a confounding variable, another possible cause. They're very popular among lay people because most people don't want to go back to baseline. They don't want to go back to the problem to determine whether the treatment was effective. They say, well, if the treatment has worked, why would we go back to baseline? But without a return to baseline, you'll never know whether it was the treatment that you designed to promote behavioral improvement that was actually responsible for the change that you see. There could be other things that led to the change in behavior. It can be something that happens in the family. It could be a new medication. It could be maturational. It could be developmental changes. It could be many things. And unless we determine empirically that it's the treatment program that we have developed and put into place, then we don't know whether what we're doing is actually effective. Well, who cares? That's the response, is who cares? Behavior's better. I don't care what worked. It just worked. But there's an ethical issue here. As an intervention specialist who charges their clients money for their treatments, you're ethically bound to actually know what it is that's actually leading to the treatment. As intervention specialists, we want to know whether what we're doing is working. And if not, you'll want to know, you'll want to change or improve the design. If it's not working, then you want to be looking at that intervention, going back to the drawing board and finding ways to improve it so that it will be more effective. Intervention specialists typically will attempt that one successful treatment with other clients. And if they're tricked into thinking that their treatment worked when really it had nothing to do with the behavior change, then they'll start off with an ineffective treatment program with other clients. And that's not ethical. So in behavior analysis, we charge ourselves with the rule that treatment should be guided by sound, well-established scientific principles, not just gut intuition. And so we use reversal designs in order to clarify and confirm that what we're doing is working or not, so that we can go back and improve our treatments. Reversal design, generally speaking, they're characterized by this baseline treatment, baseline pattern. Baseline, where you get the measures of the behavior in the absence of treatment, prior to treatment. Then you put your treatment phase in and you measure behavior, and you keep the treatment in place until behavior stabilizes and becomes reliable. And then you return to baseline by removing that treatment and seeing whether or not the behavior begins to revert back to its original patterns. We call that method the ABA design. It's the simplest scientifically valid design. Baseline treatment and a return to baseline, we call it the reversal design. It's used to reject the null hypothesis, just like a group design does. There is a null hypothesis in the ABA reversal design. And we directly test the idea that the treatment is not effective. So just like the null hypothesis in a group design, we also test to reject the null. And we predict the behavior is, the null hypothesis for us is that no matter what we do for an intervention, behavior will stay the same. And then if behavior changes, we can reject that null hypothesis. Let me show you. So here's the basic idea. We have a baseline, a treatment, and a return to baseline. In this case, it's the baseline. The treatment is the use of praise. and then a return to baseline. And what you see is that behavior is relatively high at baseline. This is the frequency of disruptions in the class when no praise is given, and the disruptions are relatively high. And so we predict as the null hypothesis that it will remain high. If our treatment is ineffective, it should just stay the same. We then put our treatment in and we begin to praise appropriate behaviors, and we see that the rate of disruptions comes down and we're able to reject this null hypothesis. It is also true that here we have a lower rate of disruptions, and if it was something other than our treatment that caused those disruptions to drop, then when I go back to the treatment condition, it should remain the same, which means that our null hypothesis would stay down here with the behavior in the praise condition. We then return to baseline, and we see it jump back up where it was previously. Over here, it starts to climb again, and again we can reject this null hypothesis. So we're using the same kind of scientific argument and null hypothesis rejection or null hypothesis testing to demonstrate that our treatment is actually effective. So, as we mentioned, the ABA design is the simplest, scientifically valid design. So we do baseline treatment, return to baseline. It's called the reversal design. It's used to reject the null hypothesis. But now we can establish scientifically that the treatment is responsible for the behavior change. If behavior returns to its original baseline levels, then the treatment must have been responsible for the change and not some other coincidental variable or factor. The ethics of this, of course, is that we do demonstrate that there is effective treatment. But when we use ABA reversal only, we end up leaving our client in the baseline condition, and that can be a problem. We really want to leave the client in the conditions that lead or produce the desired behavior change. So while the ABA reversal is scientifically valid, it does leave the client in baseline, which is back where they started, which is not a good thing. The ABA reversal design establishes a functional relationship between behavior and treatment, but it doesn't actually end up treating the client ethically. So typically, we require a return to treatment so that we leave our clients in the best possible situation. So while the ABA design is effective and scientifically valid, we prefer to use the ABA-B reversal, which has 4 conditions minimum. So you'll have a baseline 1, treatment, baseline 2, and then a return to treatment so that we leave our client in the treatment condition. This also further establishes the functional relationship between treatment and the change in behavior because you get one more reversal from the second baseline back to treatment again. So here's what it would look like. Here is a number of responses as a student performance thing. Responses are very low at baseline. Treatment is put into place. We see that it improves. We go back to baseline. The behavior again returns down to these lower numbers of responses. So then we put the treatment condition back into place and maintain it as the long-term conditions, whatever that treatment is. And now the individual is responding frequently and the number of responses is increased, and so the client is now in the better condition, and then we train the staff to maintain those new rules, those new conditions, that new setting. So why would we want to use repeated reversals? Well, first of all, it's the most obvious variation on reversal design logic. Every time you go back and forth between baseline and treatment, you establish even further the efficacy of the treatment, your confidence in the treatment, and strengthen your scientific support for that treatment. It can help you continue to rule out other variables like biases, like side bias or teacher bias or activity bias or color bias. It increases the confidence in the relationship between your independent and dependent variables, so you get a really good measure of reliability. And it produces more convincing experimental control. However, it does have limited value. There isn't a lot of value in just going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth many times, because each each time you return to baseline and go back to treatment, you're getting smaller and smaller returns. When you talk about it statistically, when you do it once, twice, or 3 times, you're making great gains in terms of the probability that your treatment is what is effectively changing behavior. But with every added replication of the treatment and return to baseline, the amount that you improve those statistical probabilities gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So there really is a diminishing returns effect on repeated reversals. So, are there any limitations? Well, yes. The ABAB design does have limitations. First of all, some behaviors don't reverse at all. So an example would be working with a child who is nonverbal and establishing language. When you remove the treatment, it doesn't necessarily mean that the language is going to go away, especially if the child is living at home with parents and family members and friends who are going to continue to use language with the child. They may never go back to baseline. So it makes a reversal impossible. It makes that logic impossible. So you're not able to return to baseline, and so you can't really use that reversal logic to strengthen your scientific evidence. Sometimes returning to baseline may not be ethical. It could be ethically questionable. So if you're engaging in dangerous behaviors like self-harm or aggression or destructive behavior, going back to baseline means that you're going to put the client or other people in danger again. And so it's only acceptable if it can be done safely. And in many cases, it may be inappropriate if you're dealing with high risk or very life-threatening kinds of behaviors. And when that happens, when you have behaviors that won't reverse or when it's not ethical to go back to baseline, we then have to turn to other forms of research designs in order to establish the efficacy of our treatment. So I'm going to stop there and come back with Chapter 3C to talk about some of these alternative research designs that allow us to treat behaviors that perhaps are not appropriately treated with a simple reversal design. So have a good afternoon, and we'll see you back for Lecture 3C.